terror, watching their brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers murdered, most dying slowly. These factory farm operators have the money to make these animals have a life worth living, but as usual, greed takes over. They have the money to make their lives better and human beings' lives as well. The dairy industry is no better, nor the fishing industry. Vast parts of the oceans have been laid to waste, with deserts created when factory fishing fleets kill everything, taking everything. We overfish, and then dolphins and whales starve, beaching themselves on land. We kill the predators of the oceans like sharks, and on land like tigers, and then we wonder why our oceans and our outdoors are so messed up, so out of balance, because the predators keep things in balance as nature intended. Not to mention drift nets killing everything in their paths in our oceans. Our electrical equipment that we use contain toxic substances that poison our land and oceans. They also contain conflict minerals. As we speak, Canadian mining companies in places like Guatemala are raping women villagers and destroying villages to get at the minerals, as well as in Africa. Rape women to rape the earth. This is modern colonization practices that have been taking place since the first Europeans landed on North and South American shores. The mining and oil industries are also raping and colonizing Africa, not to mention Afghanistan and Iraq, etc., etc., etc. In North America, the constant propaganda machine keeps us all distracted. Part of their mind control psychological warfare is to bombard us with celebrity stories and sexual imagery, to make us addicted to their products, or football or hockey games to distract us from the real issues. We need to get these criminal corporations' products off of our shelves. We need to vote in a new government that will hold companies accountable for crimes against humanity, animals, and our Mother Earth. The vast majority of the people in the Occupy movement are vegans. When the bones of animals pile up, so shall the bones of human beings. The only solution here is to boycott these companies and do not buy their wares products. Okay, in October 2011, it was October that I went on an Occupy adventure that took me to Occupy Wall Street, then across the United States to Occupy Seattle, Occupy Portland, Occupy Sacramento, Occupy San Francisco, Occupy Los Angeles, Occupy Albuquerque, New Mexico, Occupy Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Occupy Chicago, and then back to Occupy New York. The first thing I noticed about all the Occupies that I went to was their similarities. The drug addicts, alcoholics, thugs, convicts, provocateurs. Notice that pretty much all the Occupies in North America were shut down one by one at the same time. The first Occupy Montreal, October 2011. I usually visited Occupy Montreal in the evening when I had time. At Occupy Montreal, there was never a time when there was no food. I would bring donations of food to share. They also had a little table where they served drinks. The encampment was right by Square Victoria Metro, which was handy if it got too cold or rainy. The encampment tarps roofs did not sufficiently protect people from the wind and rain. The generators kept on going off. At the media tent, I spoke to a couple of activists. One gave me a little academic lecture on the movement. Apparently, she was a political science student. The other lady with blonde hair in a ponytail said one thing to me that sticks in my mind to this day. She said that we are fighting psychological warfare. I was wandering around, and this young man approached me asking me if I needed help, as if to say, "Who are you? What are you doing here, and what do you want?" He looked at me with suspicion. I rested my bag at the food tent once and needed to get at it and asked this old man to move aside. He ignored me, so I had to yell at him. At this point, he got aggressive and turned around at me, yelling obscenities at me. I quickly got out of there with my food and bag and went inside the metro. I went to eat my food and get out of the rain and wind. The same old man followed me in disturbing me as I was eating. A young man I had befriended who was an occupier was there and stepped in front of the man a little too late as he was coming at me in an aggressive way, yelling obscenities, calling me a bitch. I was like, this man has mental problems. Another time I came by, I was again in the metro at Square Victoria at the exit. Some nice activists were there, and we went down the escalator. They were going to have some kind of meeting and invited me, but this alcoholic followed us and was hanging out, dribbling all over the place and being weird. They were just tolerating this. I moved away from them up the escalator because I did not want to be around this alcoholic. I sat down later eating in the metro, and there he was, the alcoholic coming at me, dribbling on my bag. I quickly got the hell away. I was a bit grossed out, to say the least. Occupy New York was the easiest to survive because they just had so many donations being sent to them, like from everywhere. Food was plentiful. There was a real community atmosphere. The first night that I came in was rather late, so I had to scrounge a place to crash, and it was in the feminist queer positive section of the encampment. When I first set my eyes on Occupy Wall Street encampment, it looked like total chaos and very packed, smaller than I would have thought it would be. There was a band playing with punky-looking hippies banging away like there was no tomorrow on all kinds of crazy instruments like garbage cans. There was a meditation circle with an altar and various other booths like the media tent and care and medic tent. I saw all kinds of groups there, from native rights to labor unions to animal rights activists. A couple of days in my stay, I discovered the donation space building a couple of blocks from Zuccotti Square called SIS. I volunteered there helping out sort out the donations. I also worked on my political costumes there, which technically I was supposed to not do, but I made some friends. I wasn't aware of the various working groups and how they functioned. At Zuccotti Park, I made some clay breastplates at the fine arts booth with a table. I carved resist on them. I never really ever saw them again. I met a journalist there from the Wall Street Journal. I blabbed and blabbed to him about my view of the Occupy movement, my art, and my politics. There was an altar. There was a young man playing guitar at the Occupy. It was raining. Just a second. I was looking for a female model to model my next costume photo shoot. My plan was to dress her in a protest gown, but instead I got a charming 30-something actor who greeted me with a toothy grin. He was with his model girlfriend. It was raining when I painted his face. How about writing "One Love" on your face, I said. And so I painted "One Love." I dressed him in a yellow raincoat, embroidered wallets saying, "This economy sucks," made from recycled materials. All materials were from donations. One day it started to snow and it was cold. The authorities told them that they could not operate the generator because it was a fire hazard. So in the medic tent, everyone was shivering, including the medic dog. One day I spoke to an Occupy Wall Street. She told me she was one of the protesters. She told me she was deep in debt and that the credit companies kept on calling her all the time. I did not even know that all the working groups met about 2 blocks away because no one told me. No one gave me the contact info of the Arts and Cultural Working Group. I was new to this whole movement and they did not know it, and I did not know how things worked. So back to my model. As I was said, it was rainy and windy and cold when I dressed him up, so it was a bit of a challenge taking pictures in the rain. When I went to the SIS to work on my costume, they reluctantly let me work on it. They told me if they let me come and work on the project, then they would have to let other people come in. It was there that I had a rather unpleasant experience one evening. I was talking to one of the volunteers, and we were laughing. He had let me use his cell phone, when suddenly he got rather condescending, and his whole tone changed. He stated, "Hey, are you really supposed to be here?" Remember, this guy, I think, was a provocateur, because they have sent them in the past, even back in the 60s. They used to do that all the time. "I don't think you're supposed to be here," he said. I guess he was trying to push my buttons. I was rather taken aback. Then later, I needed something from the shelves, and I proceeded to help myself when he came out of nowhere, watching me like I was some sort of criminal. And he was very sarcastic. "Hey, you're not supposed to take that. You have to ask permission." I swear during my whole time at SIS, a donation center, I never encountered that extreme rudeness and sarcasm. If one or two people were annoyed with me, they would apologize and try to patch up my hurt feelings. Apparently people are coming in and out taking things, but all I saw was stuff, tons and tons of stuff, and it kept on coming in. The activists were saying that we had more than we need, and maybe we should make bags out to the various homeless shelters, and why can't the people from across the country send stuff to their local occupies? Once a lawyer came in one day offering her services. After that dreadful experience of sleeping uncomfortably in the lesbian section of camp, I ran around looking for a kindred spirit to share a tent with. The rules were we had to take our tents and tarps down during the day, but some of us risked getting them confiscated and kept them up. I kept my bag at SIS, which was sometimes a pain in the ass because they were a bit iffy about letting me keep my stuffed bag there. Anyway, I did find a very nice lady who agreed to share her two-person tent with me. We were a bit packed. The whole Occupy was surrounded 24/7 by cops, tons of them with batons. One night things got rather rowdy. Some occupier ran through the camp saying that the cops were going to raid us. It was another night that the big protest occurred when it looked like 1,000 occupiers, activists, were marching through the streets at night. You could hear them chanting loudly. They were playing cat and mouse with the police who were trying to control where the crowd was to go. Some jumped over the perimeters that the police had placed. I was talking to some Hasidic Jews. One was like, "Incredible." I told him that if we do not do something about our corrupt system, that it would get worse. I reminded him what happened with the rise of the Nazi Party in Europe in the 1930s. Seattle Occupy. This Occupy was not as prepared as Occupy Wall Street. I had my sleeping bag stolen by a drunken First Nations lady whom I had to kick out of the tent I was sleeping in. Okay, back to Occupy. Okay, on the way to the train to Seattle, I was wearing my Occupy Wall Street hat and buttons. One of the airport staff saw this and immediately became friendly with me, saying he supported us and wishing me good luck. Downtown Seattle was strangely clean and kind of soulless. I did not see any tents up, just a handful of occupiers. A food tent with not much food. Later, some of the tables would go up. Some homeless bums were hanging around. That day, there were some anti-capitalist Seattle bands playing, and all kinds of protesters, from animal rights activists to the raging grannies to women's groups to fanatical Christians to communists to Palestinian rights activists were there. There was a big mural on fabric of different environmental issues, and their artists were selling different small versions of it. I traded one of my handmade greeting cards for one of the fabric drawings, which I later sewed onto my shirt skirt, which one of the models is wearing. I also was given a t-shirt by the teachers' rights activists, which I turned into a skirt. It was a very cold that night, and my sleeping bag was not enough. People kept on stealing the sleeping bags at that Occupy. It was a very hard night as I was very cold. I got little help. Finally, I woke up at 4 a.m. and able to sleep. I went to get something hot to drink and met a Native American who told me he grew up rich and he came to support this Occupy. He said he grew up in a big house. Anyways, the next day I was dead tired. I was so tired I had to sleep during the day. There was another Native man I spoke to a few days later from New Mexico with all his turquoise jewelry. There had been a bunch of skinheads who were neo-Nazis hanging out where it was. I did not see them, but was only there for a week. People had signs on their tents. One man was building a small platform shelter in the art area. The next day in the newspaper, the police had sprayed the peaceful protesters unprovoked as they were sitting in front of Chase Bank. Rules were that all people on drugs and alcohol were not to be at the Occupy site because then the college would shut them down. The woman in I found this Native woman in my tent one night. She told me to get out. She was obviously drinking in the tent. I ran to tell security and we kicked them out. I took everything and put it in a big plastic bag. My sleeping bag was missing. She was slurring, yelling insults at me, and the security activist was holding her back. So that night I was without a sleeping bag, and all I had was emergency sleeping bag and my clothes. The emergency, the silver, the cape he's wearing in one of my photos, the model, that's an emergency blanket. I was very, very cold. It was gloomy in Seattle and raining off and on every second day in Seattle. To make the ticket to get to Portland, I had to do some door-to-door sales in an upper-class neighborhood by the water. I walked into Wells and Fargo to cash my traveler's check. I was wearing my Occupy Wall Street hat and buttons, and the teller said that why are they attacking our bank? We shouldn't be paying for this. It's not fair to make us tellers lose work. I told him the Occupy wasn't just about crooked banks, it was also about the other crooked corporations. He was like, oh, I thought it was just about the banks. So you see people they listen to the media, but they didn't go for themselves to see for themselves. When I got off the bus in Portland, I felt a bit lost, but I met a nice young lady at the station, and when I told her I was at Occupy Wall Street, she immediately warmed up to me. I asked her the directions to the Occupy, and she told me to keep on walking that way. I slowly walked into a site out of an insane asylum with mental cases, drunks, and homeless folk wandering about. There were also punks and hippies. It was a bit grungy. They brought in hay to keep the mud at bay because, it was very muddy. They had taken over a park, so there were park benches and a water fountain. In the middle of the parks in the street, dividing the two parks that they took over, was a big elk statue. In the kitchen area was a statue of Oregon's past family of the first pioneers in bronze. In fact, Portland had sculptures all over the city. The drink booth, where we get coffee and tea and juice, were volunteered by a bunch of punky kids, loud and obnoxious. They were always there, sometimes half asleep, listening to loud music on their jukebox. There were tons of food all the time, 24/7. You didn't have to worry about food at Occupy Portland. Lots of organic. There were many booths scattered all over the camp: the security tent, the info tent, the medical tent, the arts and crafts tent. There were always little fights springing up around me at Occupy Portland. The first night I slept in the staff tent. Then I subletted a tent from an older gentleman when he was gone for a few days. The tent was the best tent I slept in of the entire trip. I was comfortable and dry despite the rain. It had a lantern in it, which was great. The encampment was near Skid Row, I later learned. Now, most of these encampments that I went to were near Skid Row for some reason. My neighbors were kind of gross, and the way they talked was in a very crude and primitive way. The Portland police were non-aggressive, patrolling the area. I did not feel intimidated by them. When I went to the arts and crafts tent to check it out and do some work, I was greeted by a drunk man. When I first came to Occupy Portland, I went to one of the booths, and a muscular vegan man gave me some free passes to the gym where I could take showers. Once a preacher came to the Occupy. A bald man in his 30s preaching Jesus. He had a Bible with him. Some people got very angry. In fact, one man got very aggressive and started yelling in this guy's face to shut up and go away. Another person on a bike said, "Oh, Satan, we are possessed by Satan," mockingly. I saw the most disgusting habits at Occupy Portland, people spitting and puking in broad daylight in front of me. There were people who were donating all kinds of things at Occupy Portland, like hats, gloves, food, etc. There was a state or federal park next to us, and rules were you were not allowed to be in there after 10 p.m. So a bunch of activists, vegan, decided to pitch tents, occupy the area. This is where Occupy Portland's General Assembly would meet on a nightly basis at 7 p.m. Two activists decided to chain themselves to a barrel of cement and stay there until our voices were heard. This is where when the kitchen area started to get neglected because they were focusing on feeding the activists at the new park area. The day I left, I decided to make some hot chocolate in the kitchen, so I grabbed some goat milk at the drink station. I couldn't find any chocolate powder on the food shelf, so I used this chocolate-flavored energy drink. I ended up overboiling the concoction on the gas portable stove. I served some to the security. I drank some myself. This is when I felt a weird twitch in my stomach. At pretty much all the occupies I went to, there was chain smokers. When I waited in the food line, I would have to breathe in secondhand smoke, and when I was sitting in the stairs, somebody would be smoking by me. I needed money, so I went to this well-to-do neighborhood to do some door-to-door sales of my greeting cards. I went to this one house, and the old man said he would soon be joining us at camp and pitching his tent because the banks were foreclosing on his house. I did try to contact Occupy Sacramento. This was the next Occupy I decided to go to in California, to see how their camp out was doing, but I guess they did not read their emails every day, so I did not hear back from them. I decided to risk it and go anyways. I arrived very early, like at 9 a.m. I was met with only a small handful of people. I was surprised at how little activists were there. Turned out the city was super conservative and had banned any camping at the park in front of the courthouse. It was a Republican town. They offered to share some of their food with me. A young hippie from Portland was there and bought me something with his food stamps card. There were no real veggie restaurants nearby. I gave him one of my greeting cards as a thank you. I asked people to write on my costume. I was feeling very tired that day. I managed to raise some money on the street by talking to passerbys, and I got enough money to get to San Francisco. We had to cover our packs. I bought a sleeping bag and that had to be covered or else we would be arrested. An Asian American lawyer passed us by. He was representing the protesters. Not everyone was Republican in this town. I asked him, was he being paid? And he said, no, he was doing this as a service. 2 women journalists came by and asked to interview me. They were independent, that is, not affiliated with any major news organizations, and they were the most real reporter journalists I met on the trip. I was interviewed and filmed. I was very, very tired and feeling sick. I was definitely coming down with something. I had no strength to go back to the station and hauling my big backpack, nor the time to get my costume out of my pack so they could interview me in it. That was the second interview with me that was published. I arrived in San Francisco in the evening. I had no tent. I was greeted by a tattooed bald guy who showed me where Comfort was. That Comfort is where they give you all kinds of things you need, was so they could fulfill my sleeping needs. They were rather slow to help. It was the rainy season. Someone helped me pitch my tent, but they did not do a very good job at it. It was not waterproofed. Anyways, to make a long story short, it rained and my sleeping bag got wet and all my clothes. Yeah. This is when I got no help at all because a lot of other people's sleeping bags had gotten wet. I ended up not sleeping a wink that day, and the next day I was grumpy. I met a jolly Welshman who loved traveling. He was there, Occupy San Francisco. He was doing a documentary on the Occupies. He videotaped an interview with me. At this point, I was feeling real sick. I was tired. My allergies were super bad. I finally told him I needed to rest. I had been busy all day, so I had no time to do my laundry. I tried to get people to help who had a car so I could get my wet clothes and sleeping bag dry, but no one had a car or the time. I finally found someone, but by the time all the laundromats were closed and the only one open was in the Tenderloin district, a very bad part of town. Mind you, I have walked through the Tenderloin and they're a bit exaggerated a bit, but I did feel kind of scared for my safety at that Occupy, okay? The police, I was told, hated us. I walked by a police cruiser one day in my costume and they just kind of stared at me like I was from outer space. There were tents pitched on the sidewalk in front of the big banks, too, not just the park. The night I needed to get my laundry done was also the night that the activists were planning on expanding. So some of them were helping others pitch tents on the next block. This was distracting the police officers officers who were then focusing on stopping this expansion. I was told at the food tent that they had a real problem with ex-cons who were being dropped off at the Occupy, and the homeless people and the drug addicts, mental cases, and drunks. So the police were dropping these people off. The police were telling, go to that Occupy, you'll have food, you'll have shelter, blah, blah, blah. So this was, done at many different Occupies. But actually, all those people, the homeless people, drug addicts, and the convicts, blah, 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 made the Occupy seem bigger, so they actually helped the Occupy movement in a way, because there was not enough activists. But anyways, one convict who was always seemed angry and was causing all kinds of trouble, he would occupy other people's tents and claim it as his own. One mental case who seemed helpful and friendly to me in the beginning turned out to be friends with this convict. He told me I could sleep in his studio apartment. Since I did not know him, I declined, so he offered up his tent. He told me his story, how his building was raided one day by the police looking for people who were growing marijuana, and they had sprayed gas in his apartment, and the whole thing was a trauma, and that because of it, he got schizophrenia or something. Anyway, this guy Jay took a photo of me and said while he was taking the photo, Occupy. So he would take a photo, and then when he took it, he would go, Occupy. Well, he also told the convict that he could sleep in his tent. It was one-person tent. He had built a platform to raise the tent above ground. So I retired there for the night, and suddenly I got this angry voice outside the tent telling me I was an imposter and to get out. The convict guy then called security, and he was getting aggressive, although he never laid a hand on me. The security then started to film me and treat me like I was a criminal. I hurriedly got out of there with my stuff. I left something in there but decided to forget about it. I just left it there. I ended up being stranded and had to sleep in my very wet tent. So, sleeping in a very wet tent can make you sicker, The next day, the convict and the young man who I thought was my friend started dissing me and calling me a thief and liar. I tried to defend myself but realized it was a losing battle, so I ignored them. I got interviewed by the Spanish group who were interviewing people reading poems of this feminist nun of the 16th century. So in my costume, I read the poem and at the end slowly turned around. The convict and friend passed by me and I was doing the poem and called me a liar and thief, and the Mexican man told me to ignore him. They told me that they would send me a copy of the tape, so I gave them my email, but they never really did that. I never got that tape saying Occupy. What a nutcase. There was this group of druggies that were part of the encampment that were always in the same spot making a racket and doing drugs. One day a band was playing at Occupy San Francisco. They did not have the power to operate the sound system, so they generated electricity with a bike. Someone would be on the bike pedaling it to prolong the power for the sound system. It was in one day that I raised enough money to selling my greeting cards in my costume at camp to be able to afford to get to Los Angeles. When I got to Los Angeles, it was very early in the morning, and where the Greyhound bus station, it was very deserted. I took the bus to around the financial district, but actually was nowhere near occupied Los Angeles. I was a little lost, and it took me a while of asking around to finally find City Hall, where the camp was. When I arrived by bus, I got up and walked into camp. It was not like Occupy Portland and Occupy San Francisco. I did not see any wacky people. Most people looked normal. They were at the courthouse and near a big police station, so the police were always near. The police at this one were very friendly, in fact, a little too friendly. I knew eventually that all the camps would be raided, okay? There was always false alarms, like at Occupy Wall Street, of groups of people running around, warning of an impending raid. At this point of the trip, my allergies had reached code red, which means I was coughing every other breath. I was coughing during the day and all night. When I first came into town, I was greeted by this middle-aged black man in his 50s, and he said I could sleep in his storage tent. He was quite concerned with my well-being and said I better get to a doctor right away, and that I had bronchitis. The smokers around me were not helping my case. Medical wasn't much help because most medicines, holistic and non-holistic, had been stolen from them in a raid the week before by a bunch of punks. I learned that from info, that was the info tent, that the punks had cut their tent and stolen all the donation money, which was well over $1,000. And I thought to myself, how could anyone be so stupid as to leave all that money laying around? It was November. News got in that they had raided Occupy Wall Street, and a whole bunch of people started marching throughout the streets around the camp, banging and yelling, "Join us, Occupy Wall Street got raided." Anyways, I did end up going to one of those low-cost clinics. Yeah, I ended up being there all day and evening waiting to see a doctor. By the time I actually got to see a doctor, my bronchitis started getting better. I guess it was the medicine that Jay-Z, the man who let me sleep in a storage tent, gave me that helped me. Every time a person went into the clinic, they and all their stuff would have to go through security. At Occupy LA, I met a young 21-year-old woman from Missouri who was already deep in debt because of unpaid medical bills of over $100,000. She was with a group called the Love Tribe, and they were all sharing a space tent. I tried to get word out at a General Assembly, but there was way too many people. Everybody was talking at once. It was really rowdy. I did manage to be able to speak up, but it was for my small group, which was we all had to form and talk what we wanted to do to solve the problem. Me and this other girl both mentioned purchasing land for a vegan eco-community as a possible solution. We were told to avoid talking about ourselves and instead focus on what everyone in the small groups we formed wanted. Too many people who wanted to speak. It was like I mentioned, a loud, rowdy group. There was this one bald, elderly woman who kept on taking her shirt off, her breasts hanging out. She had drawn different symbols with, lipstick on her face. People kept on telling her to put her shirt back on. One bearded hippie asked her very firmly to put her shirt back on or she would be asked to leave. She did. She put her shirt back on. At Occupy Los Angeles, some vegan animal rights activists came in and showed a documentary about the horrors of meat production, the factory farms. I cried when I watched the film. I had to raise money for my next destination, which was New Mexico, so I was in my costume selling my greeting cards. One activist occupier got pissed off at me for using the movement to make money. At the library at Occupy LA, I was harassed by this young man from Tennessee, another provocateur. His chair was there and I did not know it was his chair, and I was sitting on it doing my artwork. He got mad at me and accused me of taking his chair and called me a thief. Anyways, I was tired and busy and he got on my nerves and pushed my buttons, so I swore at him. This just made him angrier. Then one of the activists stopped by defending me. Then the young man from Tennessee started yelling at this guy right in his face, who was perfectly calm. The activist guy was perfectly calm, and screaming in his face, yelling, "You don't talk back to a man from Tennessee, you just walk away." The food tent at Occupy LA was not that well equipped. Occupy Los Angeles was just blocks away from Skid Row. The cops were not that friendly when they showed up in riot gear when some activists started pitching tents blocks away in front of the Bank of America. I wasn't there, but I heard that they were arrested. Some good Samaritan at General Assembly who wanted to remain anonymous donated $300 or so in their defense fund. Someone paid for them to be released the next day. I was not at Occupy Los Angeles when they finally raided it. A day earlier, who should I meet in a nearby Starbucks coffee shop was my actor-model friend I had met and done a photo shoot at Occupy Wall Street. By the way, I also met him at Occupy San Francisco. Bumped into him at Occupy San Francisco as well. He was from Los Angeles. I left Occupy Los Angeles and headed by train to Occupy Albuquerque, New Mexico. On the train, I met another occupier who had been to more than 14 occupies, way more than I had. He seemed very weary and tired. It just seemed like he wanted to be alone. He wasn't that friendly. One man on the train told me that the people at the occupies were all a bunch of communists and that it was funded by communists. So when I got to Occupy Albuquerque, there was actually no Occupy, just some young people having their meeting at the university that banned them from camping out. They did mention Occupy Santa Fe, but one person started bad-mouthing the Occupy and saying there was nothing but druggies and weird people there. They all seemed a bit tired and worn out, like they had lost hope or something. The man who ran a Covenant House in Albuquerque picked me up in his vegetable-run oil car from the meeting after it ended. He told me that Covenant House was a chain started by a Catholic charity or something. It was populated by mostly homeless men. I felt a bit nervous being there by myself with this one homeless man, who turned out to be pretty harmless. The fridge was packed with food that had been donated to them by grocery stores like Trader Joe's and health food stores. I went to Santa Fe by train the next day and stayed there for a couple of days. It was evening when I arrived there. The camp was right by the train tracks. It was very nice and quiet, a short walk from the train station. It was right by the big health food store. Some men were warming their hands by the fire. There were not that many tents pitched. It was pretty spacious and clean, mostly men at camp. And they kept on telling me I would be safe there. The woman activists didn't feel safe sleeping there with a bunch of men, drunks, and homeless folk. There were a lot of First Nations people there. They were all very friendly, making sure I was warm and snug. They let me sleep in a tent that someone had lent someone, but that person had abandoned it. I was woken up in the first night in the middle of the night by some raucous drunks. I yelled for them to keep it down. My neighbor in the tent next to me told me to go sleep in a hotel if I didn't like it. One friendly First Nations guy the next day told the tent next neighbor down to apologize to me for telling me to go to sleep in a hotel. He was like, "Sorry, lady." There was one drunk native lady that was staying at camp. I was told by one visitor that I was brave for sleeping there. I didn't feel afraid, by the way, the whole time I was there. At the general meeting at Occupy Santa Fe, every time I tried to talk, I was rudely interrupted. I did not like that at General Assembly. I felt it was too controlled and, quite frankly, not that democratic. It was held in a big tent. The camp was fairly well equipped. There was one older gentleman who kept on getting on people's nerves at the camp. He and this young guy got into a fight with the young guy accusing him of stealing. They actually got into a physical fight and had to be broken up. One elderly native person complained that she couldn't get a word in at General Assembly and that it was too academic. I suggested that it be more tribal, like her native people, like the native First Nations. So I left to go back to Occupy Wall Street, New York, but did not know where I would stay because I was running out of money. On my way, the train stopped in Chicago for a couple of hours. It was Thanksgiving, but luckily I found Starbucks just as it was closing. I looked up where Occupy Chicago was real quick and headed down there. There I did not find tents pitched out, just a handful of protesters. I was told that they were not allowed to camp there. I got some of them to write messages on my Occupy shirt like I had done at the other Occupies. Someone had donated a Thanksgiving dinner and I ate the vegan portion since I'm a vegan vegetarian. Some other people had donated some unhealthy corporate Coca-Cola that a lot of people were drinking. A few people from another Occupy in the state were there. A car drove by and honked at its horns in support for the protesters. One community organizer said it was way too cold to sleep out and that people would get sick, which, I got sick, of course, during my journey, bronchitis. When I got back to New York, I called my friend from the movement and told me that since the raid that some of them were sleeping at a church. When I arrived there, I was rudely told to leave by the church minister. Instead, I was instructed to go all the way to Queens and stay at the Baxter Hotel, which was like an hour and a half away. The church was in Upper Manhattan. The Baxter Hotel was not a hotel, but a place where people put on plays. It wasn't all that fancy. The owner let us stay, but some parasites who attached themselves to the movement were stealing people's stuff and his money, so eventually we were kicked out. And then one night when I came, this woman was screaming and banging on the door, and the couple that was staying there were, they were domestic dispute or something. There was some drama, you know. There were people who were complaining and causing trouble. It was right by the beach. We had to be up very early and out of there. There was little food, so I took matters into my own hands and discovered a healthy little cafe where I traded my greeting cards for a delicious vegan sandwich and a drink, and I bought my friend a hot drink as well as a bar of artisanal soap. The young man who was with me was just only 21 years old, and most of his teeth were missing. It was back to that church. The church wasn't all that bad, actually. It was clean and spacious. There was an acupuncturist who was donating her services, and I got a treatment done there for my sore muscles. We had our meetings, and one of the speakers said that they were trying to figure out where all their money was going to be spent. They have thousands of dollars donated to them, and they were paying the church. You know, they had to pay the church to stay there. The church in New York.
Because St. Martin?
After the raid, let me finish. They had to actually pay the church for them to stay there. I went back to Zuccotti Park, which had fences all around it. The protesters were there every day, but it was not packed to capacity. I found out there was a big fight there between some of the activists and the police, and that they actually ended up banning all protests and protesters from Zuccotti. I was told that during the raid, the people lied to the activists and campers and did a technique where they herded all together so they could be arrested at once. They came without a warning with their batons and really did not treat the women with any respect, practically molesting them. My friend had his glasses broken by one of the police. They took all the books in the library and crushed them, which one of the activists showed me in the donation center, where I asked, well, why does that book look so deformed? One of the people told me he was taken out for a drink by some of the Wall Street executives because they wanted to know why they were there. Like, they have no clue. He said that they seemed nice, but just didn't understand why they were there, that they just didn't get it. By the way, in Seattle, Occupy Seattle, I forgot to mention, a nice man who frequented came by the Occupy, offered his place for me to stay, so I stayed with him for a couple of nights. It was very nice. He was very nice. Well, I have a lot of stories, but I don't want to talk forever. If you want to know more, you can always, come and see me, and I'll give you more details. If you have any questions.
Yeah, I'd like to know.
People will be reading your outfit. So if you want to commission me to make you something, I can make you an entire outfit with
That's not a print, that's a collage, huh?
This one here, I just did it all by hand, okay? It was sewn by hand. I couldn't carry a sewing machine with me, so I just, used fabric markers and stuff, and I got people to, but mostly I wrote on this myself with my own handwriting. But this is more like an environmental costume, and it talks about, how a green food, like a plant-based diet is the best diet for the planet. How the meat, the meat industry is just so much water and oil and grains need to be grown, to feed animals when we should be growing grains and feeding clean water, giving clean water to human beings, not animals. I mean, animals can go fend for themselves, and it's just like creating so much pollution. There's so much pain and misery and heart attacks, people dying of heart attacks. They eat too much meat and too much, McDonald's and all that crap. Trying to get people to you see, the only thing is the corporations, it's going to have to be the oil companies that are going to have to change, okay? They're too powerful. The oil companies own the police force. They own so much they have so much power in government, so much influence.
Bank of America, by the way, that they were protesting, where was it, San Francisco there, or LA? That they went and they were all arrested in front of the Bank of America?
Speaking of banks, I learned that
That's Rockefeller's bank.
the banks are so corrupt. The banks are evil. They're war profiteers. By the way, Chase Bank, if you Google this, Chase Bank funded the Nazis. Okay, a lot of these banks fund these